see the car, talk to him about the toter. He's even working on the Dodge. He's even working on our Dodge.
For a long stretch, Ryan Martin was defined by control, dominance, and an unbreakable calm. Victory after victory turned him into the standard everyone else was measured against, but it also placed a weight on his shoulders that no one ever stopped to question. Silence became part of the expectation. Then, with a single honest admission, that silence cracked. It wasn't a collapse or a step back, it was a reckoning. A moment that revealed what sustained excellence truly demands.
Added weight to my combination. When you put more weight in a hot rod, it just goes slower.
When slowing down is never an option. The moment. He finally spoke. The moment did not come in the aftermath of defeat, nor did it rise out of controversy or failure. It arrived softly, almost unnoticed, when Ryan Martin let a sentence stand without correcting it. Racing, he acknowledged, had carried an emotional cost. There was no dramatic setup, no pause to let the words land. The impact arrived later, settling into the silence that followed. For years, Ryan had been defined by control. Within the Street Outlaws world, he was the benchmark, the steady presence who absorbed pressure and transformed it into consistency. Victories accumulated, expectations solidified, and the narrative surrounding him narrowed until success seemed inevitable rather than earned. Control was not merely his advantage. Over time, it became his responsibility. What viewers rarely witnessed was the discipline required to maintain that control. Ryan's admission quietly disrupted an illusion that had been carefully sustained, not because it revealed fragility, but because it exposed endurance. The kind of endurance that does not demand attention, does not shatter publicly, and does not ask for reprieve. It persists, even as the cost begins to grow. When he spoke of the toll, his tone held no bitterness and no visible fatigue. It was measured and sincere. That sincerity altered the way everything before it could be understood. The long evenings spent preparing, the constant expectation to appear flawless, season after season. There was also the pressure of knowing that any variation would not be interpreted as human inconsistency, but as decline. For someone positioned where Ryan stood, excellence stopped being something to pursue and became something to uphold. The admission mattered precisely because it was not delivered as a confession. It was an acknowledgement. Ryan did not suggest the pressure had defeated him. He simply recognized its presence. That difference is significant. It reflects awareness rather than collapse, and reflection rather than withdrawal. Those closest to him understood the significance immediately. Ryan has always been deliberate about what he shares publicly, not because he withholds, but because he feels accountable for the impact of his words. He understands that what he says carries weight beyond himself. By choosing to acknowledge the emotional toll, he signaled that staying silent was no longer helpful, not for others and not for himself. Within the racing community, the moment resonated quietly but deeply. It validated feelings many had struggled to put into words, especially among those who believed success should erase doubt, exhaustion, or isolation. Hearing someone so closely associated with dominance speak candidly about emotional cost challenged the assumption that winning provides immunity from strain. Ryan did not elaborate further. He did not surround the statement with justification or soften it with humor. He allowed it to exist on its own, trusting that those who needed to hear it would recognize its meaning. That restraint gave the moment its strength. Perhaps the most powerful aspect was what he chose not to say. He did not fault the sport. He did not question his path. He did not cast himself as a casualty of expectation. He simply acknowledged that sustaining excellence carries consequences that are rarely discussed openly. In that brief exchange, the narrative shifted. It was no longer solely about results or reputation. It became about the unseen human cost behind prolonged dominance and the quiet resilience required to bear it without complaint. The admission was brief, but its effect lingered. It marked the start of a conversation delayed for years, and it set the stage for understanding what winning truly demands when the cameras stop and the silence returns. The cost that comes with winning.
Oh, there it is.
All right.
No.
Hey, when we came here, we said we wanted the money to stay in 405.
Winning reshapes pressure long before it ever reshapes a life. For Ryan Martin, success didn't arrive in one defining moment. It came gradually, layer by layer. Each victory added another expectation, and each expectation reduced the space where he could exist as anything other than dominant. Over time, winning stopped feeling like an accomplishment and instead became a requirement that always needed to be upheld. Within the Street Outlaws world, dominance is praised in public but carried in private. When a racer starts winning consistently, the atmosphere around them changes. Rivals analyze every move more intensely. Fans stop asking questions and begin demanding repetition. The margin for error tightens until even minor variations feel magnified. For Ryan, that pressure became ever-present. What many people misunderstand about long-term success is how isolating it can be. Losing opens conversations. Winning invites constant examination. Once you become the standard, every decision is judged against your own history. Ryan learned quickly that mistakes no longer served as lessons. They became indicators. That interpretation carried an emotional weight he rarely spoke about. Every race required more than execution. It required reassurance. Reassurance that he was still the same driver, that nothing had slipped, that the image of control remained intact. Over time, that need for reassurance becomes draining because it never truly ends. He felt this most strongly off the track. Preparation shifted from progress to protection. Every adjustment was reviewed again and again, not because of doubt, but because of the fear of exposing the first flaw in his reputation. When excellence becomes identity, protecting that identity consumes energy that might otherwise go toward living fully. The price of winning also extends beyond the racer himself. Family schedules adjust, time tightens, emotional presence becomes limited. Ryan understood this and carried it quietly, believing that strength meant absorbing pressure without voicing it. That mindset helped him compete, but it came with a softer, less visible cost. There was also the burden of becoming a symbol. Ryan became, whether he intended to or not, an example of what success in Street Outlaws is supposed to look like. Symbols are not granted vulnerability. They are expected to deliver consistently and communicate carefully. Ryan upheld that standard for years, choosing restraint over release and discipline over disclosure. Structure made this sustainable for a long time. Routine, preparation, and focus offered insulation. But even the strongest insulation thins under constant stress. The emotional toll he eventually acknowledged did not stem from one mistake or moment. It came from the accumulated weight of never stepping outside the role. Winning demands permanence. The audience rarely sees the effort required to remain exceptional once excellence has already been proven. Ryan lived inside that demand daily, aware that any sign of fatigue would be read not as humanity, but as decline. As a result, victories produced relief more than joy. Relief that the expectation was met again. Relief that the bar had not yet moved higher. Over time, relief replaces fulfillment, and fulfillment is what keeps passion alive. Ryan never lost his love for racing. What slowly faded was the freedom to experience it without consequence. Every race carried implications beyond the finish line, tied to legacy, reputation, and the unspoken agreement between champion and crowd. Admitting the emotional weight did not diminish his achievements. It gave them context. It acknowledged that dominance is not only physical or technical. It is an emotional endurance test with no clear endpoint. The cost of winning rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive through collapse or spectacle. It builds quietly through discipline, silence, and repeated success. Ryan's admission revealed that cost without exaggeration, allowing the truth to exist plainly. In doing so, he reshaped how success is understood, not as freedom from pressure, but as a different kind of burden that often goes unseen. The weight carried behind the wheel.
Put extra pressure on us to perform at even a higher level than we already do, because
The pressure Ryan bore was never visible in the ways most people expect strain to reveal itself. There were no public fractures, no skipped commitments, no obvious unraveling. For Ryan Martin, the burden lived beneath composure, hidden inside preparation and discipline, so polished it appeared effortless from the outside. That invisibility became part of the challenge. Racing demands total presence in a way few pursuits can. Once buckled in, there is no tolerance for distraction, no space for emotional drift. Focus becomes survival. Over time, Ryan learned to compartmentalize everything else, setting aside personal concerns, exhaustion, and doubt, so they could not interfere with execution. That skill elevated his performance, but it required persistent internal restraint. That restraint never felt extreme. It felt responsible. Ryan believed mental clutter had no place behind the wheel, especially under the weight of expectations that followed him. The outcome was a narrowing of emotional bandwidth, where anything not tied directly to performance was postponed indefinitely. Yet postponed emotions do not vanish. They collect. Within the Street Outlaws rhythm, rest is more illusion than reality. When races end, preparation immediately begins again. There is always another adjustment to review, another competitor to evaluate, another expectation to meet. Ryan's mind rarely fully disengaged, because disengagement felt like vulnerability. That constant alertness reshaped how he experienced time. Days blurred together, defined less by personal markers and more by cycles of preparation and execution. The future existed as the next race. The present became rehearsal. The past was revisited only for lessons, never for closure. What weighed on him most was not the fear of losing, but the fear of becoming unpredictable. Predictability came to mean trust. Teams depended on it. Fans expected it. Sponsors relied on it. Showing emotional strain felt like introducing instability into a system built around his steadiness. That dependence bred isolation. When so many people benefit from your control, admitting pressure feels like unsettling, more than just yourself. Ryan absorbed that responsibility, choosing silence even as the weight increased. He did not want to transfer the strain to others who were invested in his success. Silence became routine. Emotional check-ins were replaced by performance metrics. Instead of asking how he felt, he asked whether he was ready. Readiness became the only acceptable condition, even when achieving it meant ignoring discomfort. Over time, that strategy demanded a price. Quiet moments, once restorative, began to feel intrusive. Stillness allowed deferred thoughts to surface, reminding him that endurance has limits, even when discipline remains intact. The car became both sanctuary and obligation, the one place where everything still aligned. The weight behind the wheel was not merely competitive pressure. It was the accumulation of expectations Ryan had accepted without revisiting. Expectations that winning would always suffice, that composure would never waver, that leadership required silence. Ryan's later admission revealed how carefully that silence had been maintained. He was not unaware of the toll. He had been managing it privately, mistaking management for resolution. They are not the same. What changed was not his ability to perform, but his willingness to pretend performance told the entire story. The weight behind the wheel had grown too significant to remain unnamed, even if it never disrupted execution. That realization did not weaken him. It sharpened him. It showed that acknowledging strain does not create instability. It creates honesty. Honesty, unlike suppression, can be shared. For years, Ryan treated emotional weight as something to carry alone, off the track and out of dialogue. Speaking about it altered the equation. It moved the burden from isolation into perspective, where it could exist without control slipping away. The car remained unchanged. His discipline remained unchanged. What shifted was the narrative he allowed himself to live within, one where strength did not depend on silence and endurance could be named without being reduced. The weight behind the wheel had never stopped him from racing. It had simply followed him there, lap after lap, waiting for recognition. When that recognition finally arrived, it did not distract his focus. It deepened it. And in that depth, Ryan found something he had been missing. Not freedom from pressure, but permission to carry it honestly. The cost of quiet strength.
2010 Chevrolet Camaro, steel roof, steel quarter.
The emotional weight Ryan carried did not end when the engine cooled or the track lights went dark. It traveled home with him, settled quietly into everyday routines, and slowly reshaped how he showed up for the people closest to him. For Ryan Martin, this was the most difficult reality to confront, not because the strain was unfamiliar, but because it had long been accepted as part of the deal. Racing demanded total commitment, and he had learned to believe that anything less would mean failing more than just himself. Family life adjusted around his schedule long before it was ever discussed openly. Time became something to be managed in narrow windows rather than full days, measured in brief moments carved out between preparation, travel, and recovery. Presence was efficient instead of expansive, focused on reliability rather than emotional depth. Ryan valued consistency and believed that being predictable was its own form of devotion. What he did not see at first was how easily silence can disguise itself as strength. By keeping pressure contained, he thought he was shielding his family from worry. Absorbing strain alone felt like a form of protection, a way to preserve normalcy in a household already shaped by an unconventional career. Over time, that belief solidified into routine. Routine, however, has a way of disappearing into the background. Emotional distance rarely presents itself as absence. It looks like fatigue, distraction, or attention redirected elsewhere. Ryan never stopped caring. He stopped explaining what he was holding. Those around him sensed the weight without being able to trace its source. This created a subtle imbalance. He remained dependable but less open. Conversations stayed functional. Concerns were addressed quickly instead of explored fully. Emotional texture gave way to logistics. On the surface, everything ran smoothly, which only made what was missing harder to notice. Racing families often learn to accept physical absence, but emotional absence is more difficult to define. Ryan's presence when he was home made it easy to assume everything else was intact. Yet the mental load he carried rarely eased, even in moments intended for rest. The sacrifice was quiet. It appeared in shorter patience, in moments when his thoughts returned to the track without warning. Recovery became preparation rather than restoration. Rest only felt justified if it improved performance, not if it deepened connection. This mindset did not come from indifference. It came from responsibility. Ryan felt accountable not just for winning, but for the stability that winning created. Addressing his own emotional needs felt unnecessary compared to the tangible demands placed on him. Silence became the tool he used to manage that responsibility. He did not want to burden family members with worries they could not fix. He did not want concern to become another distraction. He trusted that love could endure distance as long as commitment was visible. Over time, however, distance acquires meaning. It does not erase connection, but it changes its texture. His family learned to read his state through behavior instead of conversation, adapting to cues he never put into words. This adaptation worked, but it was one-sided. Ryan did not learn how to receive support in the same way he gave it. What later became painful was realizing that silence had been mistaken for self-sufficiency. Those around him believed he was managing because he never said otherwise. His composure reassured them, and that reassurance quietly closed the door to deeper questions. Ryan did not resent this dynamic. He understood his role in creating it. He had designed his own isolation, believing leadership meant carrying weight without spreading it. In racing, that instinct earns respect. At home, it gradually narrows intimacy. The emotional toll, he later acknowledged, was not sudden. It was cumulative, built from years of choosing restraint over expression. Each choice made sense on its own. Together, they formed a pattern with little room for vulnerability. Life continued. Milestones passed. Responsibilities were met. Nothing appeared broken. That stability made it easy to write off discomfort as temporary fatigue rather than imbalance. Ryan told himself things would ease after the next race, after the next season. They did not. What finally changed was not circumstance, but awareness. He began to recognize how instinctively he chose silence, even when honesty was possible. The realization arrived quietly, without blame. Silence had protected others, but it had also protected the pressure itself, allowing it to persist. Naming it later was not just about racing. It was about changing how he showed up at home. It was acknowledging that strength does not require invisibility, and that sharing weight does not diminish reliability. What surprised Ryan most was the response. Honesty did not create instability. It brought relief, relief that the distance had context, relief that composure had never meant emptiness. Family conversations widened. Emotional check-ins replaced purely practical ones. Racing remained demanding, but the load was no longer carried alone. Why he finally chose to speak.
The only decision I'm trying to make in my head is leave it alone, maybe pull that belly.
The decision to speak did not come from a single moment of collapse. There was no dramatic failure, no public backlash, and no defining loss that forced reflection. For Ryan Martin, the realization arrived the way clarity often does, after long periods of endurance, quietly and without urgency, when silence stopped feeling protective and began to feel unnecessary. For years, Ryan believed that carrying pressure privately was part of the responsibility he owed to his role. He learned early that consistency builds trust, and trust sustains momentum. Talking about strain felt like introducing instability into a system that depended on predictability. The longer success followed him, the more that belief solidified. What changed was not the pressure itself, but Ryan's relationship with it. He began to understand that unspoken strain does not fade with time. It accumulates. It shapes reactions, narrows perspective, and limits emotional range in ways that are difficult to recognize from the inside. What once felt like discipline gradually began to resemble confinement. This realization did not weaken his dedication to racing. It refined it. Ryan recognized that endurance sustained through suppression eventually reaches a limit, not because skill disappears, but because long-term sustainability does. He did not want to encounter that limit without first acknowledging what had been carried beneath it for so long. There was also a growing awareness of influence. Ryan understood that his position within the Street Outlaws world made his silence instructive, whether he intended it or not. Others looked to him not only for results, but for signals about what success demands. If success required emotional isolation, that message would pass quietly from one racer to the next. He did not want to leave that legacy. Ryan had seen younger competitors mirror his composure without understanding its cost. He had watched silence become synonymous with strength and emotional restraint mistaken for professionalism. Realizing that his behavior might quietly shape others' expectations forced him to reconsider the responsibility tied to visibility. The choice to speak was also deeply personal. Years of compartmentalizing experience had created distance between what Ryan felt and what he allowed himself to express. Bridging that distance required vulnerability not in competition, but in identity. It meant accepting that honesty would not weaken credibility, even if it challenged assumptions. He did not rehearse the admission or position it carefully. When he spoke, the words arrived plainly, without explanation or defense. Racing had taken an emotional toll. He did not define it further. He trusted the statement to stand on its own. That trust mattered. Ryan had spent years controlling narrative through omission rather than misdirection. Allowing a statement to exist without qualification felt risky, but also freeing. It removed the burden of justification and allowed interpretation to develop naturally. The response affirmed that choice. Rather than unsettling perception, the admission deepened respect. People recognized themselves in it. They understood the weight, even if they had never named it themselves. The truth did not weaken confidence. It normalized complexity. Ryan ultimately recognized that silence had begun working against him. It no longer preserved energy, it drained it. Speaking did not eliminate pressure, but it redistributed it, allowing support to exist where isolation had once been default. His view of leadership shifted as well. Leadership, he realized, is not defined solely by endurance. It is defined by clarity. By articulating what others hesitate to say, leaders create space for healthier patterns to emerge. Ryan did not set out to start a conversation about emotional toll. He simply stopped avoiding it. Timing played a role. He spoke after years of consistency that made his credibility unshakable. This was not vulnerability rooted in insecurity. It was vulnerability grounded in stability. That distinction allowed the message to land without undermining confidence. Speaking did not require him to compete less fiercely or care less deeply. It simply allowed the human cost of excellence to exist alongside its rewards. In many ways, the admission marked a transition from management to integration. Pressure was no longer something to suppress, but something understood. Silence had served its purpose, and it was no longer necessary. Speaking was not an act of defiance or exposure. It was an act of accuracy. By choosing clarity over control and truth over appearance, Ryan expanded what success can look like. Not by lowering standards, but by acknowledging the cost of meeting them. The admission did not close a chapter. It opened a conversation that had waited long enough, allowing a fuller understanding of what endurance truly demands when winning never stops asking for more. The quiet transformations. Once the words were spoken, nothing dramatic followed on the surface. There were no grand announcements, no shift in branding, no visible step back from competition. Yet, inside Ryan Martin, something essential had changed. The admission did not heal a wound. It altered how he carried it. That adjustment, subtle as it seemed, began shaping every decision that came next. The first transformation was internal permission. Ryan no longer felt obligated to treat emotional strain as background static, to be ignored indefinitely. By naming it, he gave himself room to recognize when pressure was building rather than waiting for it to force its way forward. This shift did not weaken discipline. It sharpened it. Awareness replaced suppression, and that difference mattered. Preparation began to include recovery in ways it never had before. Not rest as indulgence, but rest as necessity. Ryan came to understand that sustainability is not a side effect of excellence. It is a requirement for it. Discipline that once focused entirely on output started accounting for input, not only physical, but emotional as well. Within the Street Outlaws environment, the impact was quiet but noticeable. Conversations softened. Others felt permission to acknowledge their own strain without fear of appearing less committed. Ryan never intended to become a reference point, but credibility has a way of creating influence. When someone known for consistency speaks honestly, people listen. For Ryan personally, the future stopped feeling like endless repetition under expectation. It became navigable. Pressure still existed, but it no longer defined him completely. He could engage with it deliberately, adjusting instead of absorbing. That flexibility restored a sense of agency he had not realized he'd surrendered. Difficult days did not disappear. Racing still demanded precision, risk, and relentless focus. What changed was how those demands were carried. They became part of a broader equation rather than the entire sum. Readiness was no longer measured solely by performance. It was measured by balance. Ambition recalibrated, not reduced, but clarified. Ryan remained fiercely committed to excellence, but he no longer tied self-worth exclusively to outcome. That distinction protected motivation. It allowed passion to exist without being consumed by obligation. Others noticed the steadiness that followed, not because Ryan looked different, but because the tension surrounding his dominance eased. He still competed with intensity. He simply did so without the same internal compression. The ripple effect extended beyond racing. Ryan's honesty challenged the idea that emotional cost signals misalignment. Instead, it reframed strain as inherent to commitment. The question shifted from whether pressure exists to how it is handled and shared. This reframing mattered because it offered an alternative to burnout. It suggested longevity requires adaptability, not just toughness. Looking ahead, Ryan understood honesty would continue to demand courage. Speaking once did not erase old habits, but the line had been crossed. Silence was no longer the default. Emotional check-ins became as valid as mechanical ones. This integration did not slow performance. It protected it. What changes going forward is not the standard of excellence, but the cost of meeting it. The cost becomes shared instead of hidden, contextualized instead of carried alone. That shift strengthens individuals and stabilizes the community. Ryan did not present his admission as a lesson. He simply told the truth. Yet truth, spoken by someone others watch closely, teaches whether intended or not. This chapter is not about vulnerability replacing strength. It is about precision replacing myth. Precision about what winning truly demands, what it costs, and how that cost can be carried without eroding the person paying it. Ryan Martin remains disciplined, competitive, and relentless in pursuit of excellence. What has changed is the space he allows himself within that pursuit. That reclaimed space reshapes everything that follows. What Ryan shared was never meant to redefine him, but it has refined how his story is understood. This was not a confession of weakness, but an acknowledgement of endurance. If you want to understand what sustained excellence really demands when the noise fades and the pressure remains, stay with this series. Subscribe, follow, and keep watching. The most powerful moments in racing are often the ones that happen quietly, long after the engines cool. Some victories are loud, measured in trophies, numbers, and headlines. Others happen quietly, in the moments when pressure is finally understood instead of ignored. Ryan Martin's journey reminds us that true excellence isn't just about how hard you push, but how wisely you carry the weight that comes with it. As the races continue and expectations never ease, the real story unfolds beneath the surface. If you want to understand what sustained greatness truly requires when the noise fades and the cameras cut, stay with this series. Like, subscribe, and keep watching, because the most important moments often happen after the engines go silent.